Exposure. Exposure in simple terms is how much light reaches the photosensor in your camera, and just as important, for how long. This example photograph is what we call overexposed. It could be for one of two reasons. It could be that too much light hit the sensor because the light was too bright, or maybe the light wasn't really too bright, it was just that the light continued to hit the sensor for too long a period of time. When the exact opposite occurs and not enough light hits the sensor, or the available light didn't hit the sensor for a long enough amount of time, then our photograph is what is called underexposed. As you can see, this example is very short of light and a perfect example of an underexposed photograph. Exposure. To get a nicely exposed photograph that we can see and enjoy, is on a basic level dependent on the amount of light that hits the sensor and the length of time the sensor is exposed to that light. Think of it this way. If the light is very bright, then the time the sensor is subject to that light has to be short. If the light is very weak, then the sensor will have to be subject to that light for a longer period. Now we know, we have to control the amount of light and the amount of time the photosensor is subject to that light. Let's start with controlling the light, and look at time later. The light has to get to the sensor somehow, and of course it comes in through the lens. On its way to the sensor, it has to pass through the aperture. In simple terms, the aperture is the hole that the light passes through to get to the photosensor. In most cases, the aperture is enclosed inside the lens. Let's look at the aperture. The aperture. Looking at this lens, you can see that the aperture is, like I said earlier, the hole that the light passes through from the outside world to get to your sensor. The aperture is made up of thin metal blades that can be adjusted to create these different sized holes. There is a little lever on the lens that is operated by the camera to open or close the aperture to the size that you set before you take a photograph. When you look through your viewfinder on a nice clear day or a well-lit room, you will be looking through the aperture in its resting position, which is at its widest, which makes sense because you need to see as clearly as possible what you are looking at. Looking at the diagram, you can see that the widest aperture is labeled f1.4. Different lenses have different maximum aperture sizes. You will set the size of hole required, but the aperture won't close to the size you have set until you press the shutter button. This is explained further in the shutter section. You will learn about which aperture size to choose later, and why. Though the aperture does affect how much light gets through to the lens, its main function is to control something known as DOF, depth of field. We can look at this and what it means later, but for now we will look at the way it controls light. So why does the aperture not close to the size you set straight away, instead of waiting until you take the photograph by pressing the shutter button? If the aperture closed to f8 before you took the photograph, it would be very difficult to see what you are photographing through the viewfinder. Things would look very dark trying to see through that small hole. Before we move on, let's look at the strange labels for aperture sizes. The different sizes are usually referred to as f-stops. The numbers are derived from the mathematical relationship between the focal length of the lens, which is where the f comes from, and the diameter of the aperture. There is no need to get too complicated, but as a very basic example, let's say we have a 50mm lens and we set the aperture at f2, so mathematically we have 50 divided by 2, which mean the aperture will be 25mm in diameter. You don't have to remember this, but it does make mathematical sense that the bigger the f number, the smaller the aperture and vice versa. In the next video, we will have a look at the next important thing, the shutter. Don't forget to subscribe.